Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the World Economic Federation podcast. My name is Brian Odhiambo, and we are joined by a very special guest today. He's become a fan favorite, and he's, as you've seen before, he's Jonathan Finley, and he's the World Economic Federation architect. So, John, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me again. Helps.
You're most welcome. Thank you so much for always gracing us with your presence. So, if you're tuned in today, we're going to be talking about ERCs. Those are energy reserve credits, and our architect is going to guide us in the journey and is going to give us an introduction to what it is and is going to explain it to us better and help us understand it even better. So, thank you so much. And if you're joining us today, don't forget to share, subscribe, and like and share with all your friends and family. And you can get our podcast on YouTube, and you can get it on all streaming platforms, including Spotify. You can get it on Google Podcasts and also Apple Podcasts. So, John, thank you so much for being with us today. Yeah. So as we begin, our first question is, or the first introduction to this is, could you kindly explain to us in simple terms what energy reserve credits are and how they differ from traditional financial instruments like, let's say, war bonds?
Well, I think a good way to approach it would be to back up a little bit just for what this process has helped me help formulate better. Because one of the problems is that there's a lot of reasons things are in place, and sometimes I have trouble separating them. And one of the bits of feedback that I've gotten is that I tend to use two term of art, and
Mm.
that has allowed me through saying, okay, what's your next question and how do I explain that? And eventually I get a better idea of how to explain this.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful to yourself and the other people that have watched these videos that have been kind enough to give me constructive feedback. I think a good way to describe the energy reserve credits is actually to go back, starting with the stages of the Federation in its broadest scope.
Yeah.
Step one is the social media phase, which is what we're entering into right now. The
Yeah.
social media phase is what you might consider a hybrid between Costco and social media, only your general profile of social media as that develops will increasingly become kind of the free sample. We that's not our actual business. It's just kind of a means to organize. Or another example might be the chicken or the hot dogs and various things like that that Costco has as part of the experience of being there.
Mm.
Um, the membership gives you the discounts of being that social media member, but you can still use this platform for social media, even
Yeah.
if you don't care for all of our other offerings, because privacy is important to social media users, and that need is not being met.
Yes.
So this is the first stage. The second stage is where the parts that we do more monetize, which is the products and services from the more active transaction side of the website, not the specific social media person to person contact, but more things like the gig economy and
Mm.
other services and such.
Yeah.
Those we can actually justifiably charge a small commission on, but a far smaller commission than other websites that provide gig platform. First of all, because in my mind, this is governed by um, the Gigster Guild, where
Yeah.
the commission taken is essentially at cost plus a small amount for investment into green infrastructure.
Yeah.
That, in fact, is where the the first instance where you might run into a energy reserve credit, where
Yeah.
for every energy or every dollar that gets invested into the green energy infrastructure, that account creates a energy reserve credit that will eventually be matured, because it's a lot like the war bond, but rather than being towards war and destruction, it's towards building green energy infrastructure and addressing the war on climate change. So
Yeah.
that's the first step. The second step is, once you start having that income generating over on the website side through the various commissions, but then also you start having those batches of green energy infrastructure selling that energy to the grid. You then take the dollars made and
Yeah.
then use that to simply mature those
Yeah.
energy reserve credits over time. And in
Yeah.
doing that, you then get to bundle things up and the provide that return on investment to the system itself, so that that can be leveraged to access more credit, which will eventually be fulfilled through the sale of green energy. But the other nice thing about that is that that social media site is still also generating revenue, which means that that can be used to access credit as well. That's where you start to get those positive private equity mechanics, because all this income then in turn allows you to access credit and buy additional chunks of green energy infrastructure. And in all that time, every time original dollar is being spent, the system gets an energy reserve credit, and then the system sells that matured energy reserve credit, which is now an energy credit, on the exchange, which will eventually be available, where someone purchases the energy credit, and then the system gets those dollars back in return, and the entire positive cycle towards addressing climate change can go back over and over again, while at the same time ultimately being used as an opportunity to decirculate. So that's the second stage. And then the third stage is where I've referred to as more of the logistics stage. That's where you have supply chains and an increase of the small and positive business support program,
Mm.
where, yeah, we not only provide the supply chain logistics, but we're also providing communications as an extension of the social media and various things along those lines. And by
Yeah.
that point, you have a fairly matured federation, and then it becomes more a series of rinse and repeat. Where
Mm.
you there? Okay. Uh, where it's a series of rinse and repeat. And
Yeah.
by that point, it's simply at scale, and we're trying to get to the point where we meet everyone's needs. So
Yeah.
you'd have a bunch of people with the UBI with access to these various uh, uh, benefits of the Federation, and we keep on going until everybody is covered.
Yeah.
And then the final stage is where you have something more like, well, the Federation in Star Trek, where you don't have a bunch of people in poverty to force them to work for employers who don't value them. Say they value the sanctity of life, but not its quality. They say they value democracy, but not if
Mm.
it means it has taxes and various things like that. We are unapologetically pro people, pro humanism. And on top of that, we also pro environment and pro
Mm.
democracy.
Yeah.
Right now, we have a whole bunch of people in the world saying how much those values mean to them. But every time those values get in the way of a little bump to the stock price, they're like, do we mean it that much?
Mm.
Which is then leads to this neoliberal race to the bottom where every election cycle has the people turning against each other because, well, democracy is on the line. But
Yeah.
if the leaders are actually working to defend and uphold democratic ideals, democracy should never be on the ballot.
Yeah.
And what we have now is two parties that have decided, well, I don't like this part of the Constitution. And the other side says, well, I like this part of the Constitution, but I'm not willing to invest to protect it. And they're
Mm.
all doing that.
Yeah.
So if you want to know what those respective things are, just simply say to someone who disagrees with you, what rights does my party want to take away from you that
Yeah.
you believe prevents you from doing more about solving these problems? And then maybe we can address those. Let's
Yeah.
not make it about woke or non-woke or whatever. Let's talk about the humanist principles and ideals that aren't politically divisive because it's just being a good human being rather than
Mm.
a political framework which gives an excuse to our political leaders to say, well, these are principles, but we live in the real world. We couldn't
Mm.
possibly look out for everybody. There's got to be some poverty. If if the employment rate gets, if too many people have jobs, well, then employers, they can't get as good of prices out of their potential employees. And those
Yeah.
employees might walk away and say, that's all right, I'll work for someone else who actually acknowledges that dignity and the dignity of a living wage are things that workers are worthy of.
Yeah. Oh, great. And we've actually even talked about what I was going to mention as my second question, which was wanted you to give us a breakthrough of how the mechanics of the ERC work and how it matures through the sale of energy credits. But you've touched that very well. And the Costco analogy is also great to help, some of our new listeners and people who are just being introduced to this topic. So that's great. So moving on to our next question is you've mentioned in the past that ERCs maturing from their own sponsorship pool, and how do these ERCs benefit consumers, and how do they incentivize green energy adoption?
Well, for the first thing I'll point out is the dollar that is in your pocket right now is only credit. It's not a measurement of productivity. It's by fiat because I said so. That's
Yeah.
what fiat essentially is, not saying it's fiat because I said so, just to be
Yeah.
clear. And
Mm.
when you have only credit but no productivity, that's what drives inflation because there's so much credit out there, but your society isn't producing enough. And that's effectively what happens when we have inflation. It's not like people asking for too much when they're working a honest day.
Mm.
It's the people at the top who sit there and say, well, I'm going to take all this, so I have a whole lot more than you, and I'm going to use that to control commodity markets or various other industries. Or as we see in the social media industry today, is we have a lot of bad actors in the social media industry, and What are you going to do? Not use Facebook? Who's ever
Mm,
going to solve this problem of, yeah, how do you pay for the hosting? How do you pay for this? How do you pay for that?
mm,
So, since no one's going to solve that problem, you might as well just stay with the devils you know.
yeah.
And what we're saying is look, this is a loss leader. This isn't our business model. Our business model is more in the goods and services side, but there's nothing that says that the social media can't be something that we use to lock down. And then
Mm,
on top of that, the green energy eventually starts coming in as the green energy funds squeeze out the fossil fuel industry. And
mm,
eventually, you're just going to have a situation where green energy is simply the means of production. And then that goes towards paying everything back while at the same time financing the, or funding, I should say, funding the UBIs, the healthcare system. So while in the current version of capitalism, you have people always trying to get monopolies so they can start grinding up the price without increasing their overhead, what we're trying to do is say, look, we're in the green energy business. And our goal is to drive prices down for you because this is what people depend on to live. And in
yeah.
the current mercantilian uh, economy, control over something people need to live is the ultimate power play. What are you going to do? Not get this health care? What are you going to
Mm,
do? Not have your cancer treated? If you do that, you're just going to die. So you
mm,
better open up your wallet, take out a second mortgage on your house, run your family's finances into the ground because if you don't, you're going to die. So
yeah.
everything you worked for throughout your entire life, if you're at toward closer towards the end of your life, you won't be able to leave anything to your kid because the entire system is built to say, and by the way, you won't get to leave anything to your kids,
Mm,
be
yeah.
it through the uh, estate taxes that at this point, because, for example, you have large organizations driving up the value on the real estate, including agricultural land, you
Mm,
have a situation where a farmer's uh, farm will start to actually trigger that uh, the estate tax, and
yeah.
that forces a distressed sale, which then in turn puts that on the market for the hedge fund owned or private equity owned system to buy up for pennies on the dollar because someone's got to pay the tax man. That's the
Yeah.
weaponization of the tax system against citizens that actually have families to feed versus the current system, the system where we want to go into, where no, this is your family's legacy. If they're not interested in farming, yeah, go ahead, sell it, get a good price. But it should be through a distressed sale if your property is not having all of those prices driven up so it actually triggers that estate tax, which
Yeah.
is one of the other reasons that that tax in particular is being used to divide the urban communities from the rural communities because it comes down to the control of real assets. And the more you move the working class out of the rural areas and into the cities, that creates another dependency, which those hedge funds and private equity funds can use to control the labor groups and
Yeah.
control labor in general.
Mm. Oh, interesting. So, moving on to our next segment. And so, what about for financial institutions? How do they utilize, these ERCs as collateral for loans? And, what advantages does ERC offer over, more traditional collateral assets? Yeah.
Well, the thing about an ERC is that it will eventually be backed by a fiat dollar that is gained through a actual commodity which we are in constant need of. The
Yeah.
reason why we cannot get off of fossil fuels is because fossil fuels is the basis of our current finance markets, credit
Yeah.
markets, fiat systems. The thing that made the dollar the dominant currency for as long as it was the petrodollar structure. And that
Mm.
effectively tied our currency to the ability to buy oil.
Yeah.
And as long as the United States supremacy over the global market or the conservative business orthodoxy is controlling the fossil fuel industry, they have you can have enough of a lot of things, but in a modern economy, it's very hard to have enough energy. And once you have
Yeah.
enough energy, then things start getting really cheap. And if you're an economic system built on scarcity, there's no incentive to make energy cheap because when you
Yeah.
can control something, you can drive up the price while minimizing the supply for through various ways. And that's effectively the role OPEC plays. So while green energy startups are struggling to get access for money because, well, how do you justify how they get money? At the same time, the government is subsidizing pipelines, the government is subsidizing infrastructure, other forms of infrastructure. The government is selling access to oil reserves owned by on government land in trust from the
Yeah.
people. That they have all of these things, and then they get to buy it for pennies on the dollar, and then they get to use the control of that commodity to turn up the prices on the people. And whether they're actively a part of OPEC or not, the business ties through the various financial institutions still exist.
Yeah.
So people in the same industry see, and if that industry is under threat by economic incentives or political policy or climate change itself, those parties have a very good reason to want to overthrow everything that could stand to challenge their ability to maintain that control.
Yeah.
And if that happens to be democracy too, well, it's not like they need to depend on this public infrastructure to live. They
Yeah.
own what used to be public infrastructure. They own what used to be the land that grew your
Yeah.
food. They own the land on which your building sits and they charge you rent. So it's basically using hedge funds and private equity to turn the globe into the company's store. And
Yeah.
whatever company ends up owning that company's store, well, they get to say which democracies survive and which democracies die. And if it's an undemocratic company, they're going to say, "Well, we don't like democracy in general. We're a monarchy. We're a oligarchy. We're a." And who's going to speak up for democracy?
Yeah.
Because, on the other hand, green energy is sustainable, we can say, look, the more we build the infrastructure, the more we can squeeze out fossil fuels. And that eventually can lead to a reduction in those prices. And rather than having a bunch of oligarchs and having a bunch of monarchs benefiting, or hedge funds or whatnot benefiting from the externalization of liabilities, because you can't regulate them, they're the makers in society. So, God forbid, they have to clean up after themselves. Because of that, we can now say, no, we don't externalize and we don't burn fuel, we create fuel. They don't actually create anything. They seize, they pump, they refine, but the energy they've created, then they have to go back and start all over again. We, on the other hand, our infrastructure goes up, and as long as it's maintained, we can always make more of it, and that will just force fossil fuels more and more to the back burner to be used in the things where specifically they need to be used, because there's going to be a place for fossil fuels for quite some time, because you can't haul. Batteries are not, or are not at this point, a good replacement for diesel, because diesel's better for logistics, for example. So you go from diesel to synthetic or biodiesels, and then you actually allow those engines to continue to be made using the same supply chains and so on and so forth, but using net neutral fuels rather than the fossil fuel based system that we're currently on. And that can give longer life to the vehicles that are already on the road, because, among other things, if you took all the fossil fuels off the road right now, where do you put all the trash? No one's told me anything about the logistics. So yeah, might going towards all electric be a good strategy? Yes, that could be, if you had the technology, but we don't have the technology. Omar Bradley once said something to the effect of, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. We have a lot of politicians that come up with strategies to address the climate crisis, but they never talk the logistics of addressing the climate crisis. And they don't have much incentive to hire the experts to have those logistics filled out, because ultimately their donors and a financial system that supports them are all in on fossil fuels, even when it threatens democracy itself.
Interesting. So for some of the market applications, you've discussed in the past, and you've discussed that the ERCs, they can be used as, commodity products which are tradable by, the financial industry. So what do you foresee? How do you foresee ERCs being, bundled and traded, and what regulatory considerations are crucial here?
Well, when I talked to the CFTC, they're the commodity regulators, they told me, until you start having this commodity being transacted towards unaccredited investors, until you do that, we're well within bounds that we don't need regulation. At which point I said, I'd kind of like you to regulate anyway, simply because, more oversight, the better. We're welcoming regulation and oversight. We don't want this to be some sort of technocratic takeover of the financial system. We already have a bunch of technocrats running the financial system to the detriment of the working class. So we don't need to have some new boss who's exactly like the old boss, which leads back to the whole separation of powers and democratic structure to the trust that holds it. I don't see this being a consumer level product and for ERCs until, you know, stage two, stage three, once we can know what kind of rate we need to be developing and who our various partners are. In the shorter term, I see it more as the financial institution. Financial institutions, if they want to participate themselves, and the countries themselves, because the ERCs are in fact how part of how the respective governments can balance their national debt.
Yeah.
So let's say, for example, you're in Kenya. If Kenya was to use its access to international markets as well as their ability to create money, they could effectively purchase large amounts, I should say, of green energy infrastructure where it could be built in somewhere like the United States, which has more centralized of a power grid. So that also puts all of those resources so they don't have a supply chain.
Yeah.
So the place that has some of the most dependency on fossil fuels is immediately starting to take off the incentive for their colonialism in pursuit of those fossil fuels. And as those ERCs are matured, they can then use those ERCs maturity to pay off their respective uh, debts to the international finance markets that have had more of a predatory lending philosophy.
Yeah.
Uh, so not only that is when they get those energy sponsorships, they can also start increasingly funding government without the need of taxation. Right
Yeah.
wingers or conservatives, as I should say, when I was growing up, always just said, well, we believe the government should just be run more like a business so it provides value rather than engages in taxation.
Yeah.
That's gone the way of the dodo. It's more about the control of state violence at this point. And state violence, the early stages is the removal of rights that protect people from the state violence because they're not looking for equitable exchange as capitalism says it offers. They're really
Yeah.
just looking for control.
Yeah.
So what we're effectively doing is saying they can then use those mature ERCs to say, okay, this is how I pay off my debt. This is how I disincentivize the colonial powers from colonizing me.
Yeah.
This is how I break their dependency on fossil fuels. That combined with the fact that since there would be a horizon to the end, and a clear model that can displace fossil fuels. It's no longer we only have so much, and we've got to price it because there's no other option. Clearly, because we keep out and look knocking the legs out from under any attempt to do otherwise. So our role is to take that position within the credit markets and use what used to be the war bond mechanic, but apply it to a internal corporate bond. And because governments no longer actually pay off their debt, they just get to print money. That's what
Yeah.
drives inflation, which is why control of real commodities is where the real power is at.
Mm.
So once you cause enough dysfunction in the government, you convince the people to have the government sell that to them because we're clearly the only ones that know how to exploit them. And then they say, well, now that we have control, you need to pay whatever we want. And now you better subjugate your workforce to extract our minerals well, our mineral wealth, not your nation's mineral wealth or whatever commodity they're there for.
Mm.
So the whole point of the ERC is to, on one side, make it so they are individually compensated for the infrastructure that they purchase, where the $1 goes towards maturing their energy reserve credit pool,
Mm.
and another aspect goes towards what they actually make. So
Mm.
within every second dollar, you get it divided up where some of it goes towards maturing, creating infrastructure to mature ERCs. And every high level participant in that system has the ability to do this.
Yeah.
And as they create ERCs, some of every second energy credit builds that infrastructure larger and larger as well, including the infrastructure that they get. So they're actually making more than the first dollar plus some of the second dollar.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how clear I'm being on that, but the point is that because some of it goes towards the immediate need, because right now we're told capitalism says you can either invest in the future or you look to immediate needs. And it's like, no, healthy economics, healthy capitalism depends on future investment. So you can't create a capitalist system that doesn't make both kinds of investment
Yeah.
and still consider it capitalism, which is why you have that two-way split, one towards the system, which involves the ERC maturation platform, and then the other one goes towards that sponsor, which in this case would be the country. And
Yeah.
because they're making that money through their actual sponsorships, well, that's money, that's credit made good on their energy reserve credits.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have the energy reserve credits going, now that I've matured, you can pay off your debt and completely divorce yourself from the World Bank
Yeah.
and other neo-colonialists that simply use the financial and credit system to hide they're doing the exact same thing they did 100 years ago, just like it's been applied to individual students today through the student loan system.
Yeah.
It's the same playbook at this, just at different levels. You create dependency on the credit this organization controls, but you make sure that they never get to reap the benefit of that credit being unleashed.
Yeah.
And that's what we have for the working class today. And the
Yeah.
Federation says, no, some of it has to go towards future investment. And that means productivity. And that means the working class. And then this other part can go towards meeting today's needs through all these other various sponsors and projects that have their own funds.
Yeah. And so, just delving deeper into what you're saying. So, what somebody who is listening to this would want to know. So, what exactly is the role of the federation in all this? And what specific roles does the World Economic Federation play in, overseeing, the ERC systems integrity and also transparency? And how, if there are any measures in place, how do we collaborate with banks and regulators, to achieve some of these goals?
Well, I, of course, would be more than happy when the FDIC comes knocking. Uh, I've already reached out to the CFTC. I got the whole people don't normally ask us for regulation. So then I
Yeah.
went to the Federal Trade Commission and I got to talk to a representative from there, and she said, "Yeah, I people don't normally ask us to regulate them and make sure they
Yeah.
keep all of their promises proactively. We generally just wait for people to not keep their promises and then you'll hear from us. So keep your promises and you'll never hear from us." And I'm like, well, yeah, but oversight's good.
Mm.
So what I ended up going for is, well, first of all, there's the auditors group.
Yeah.
The auditors group is a independently elected group that is effectively elected by voting district. To use an
Mm.
American analogy, I don't know what they call their anyone else calls their various voting districts, but we're putting our democracy on top of the voting democracy that already exists because ours is ranked choice. What is established because it's kind of a more corrupted democracy that's just democratic enough that people have some say, but ultimately, if you don't play ball with the current financial system, we take it all away.
Yeah.
We are more of the line of no, we are here to actually be democratic, and all these people are telling you don't trust democracy. What they're really using to turn against you is the intentional breaking of democracy to make it dysfunctional through corruption.
Yeah.
And that corruption is allowed to grow and fester because there's nothing that political leaders hate more than accountability.
Yeah.
And their donors hate accountability just as much, if not more.
Mm. Yeah.
So, what we are trying to effectively say is no, we welcome accountability. And because these groups have control over both systems, they will use their control of the accountability system to make sure that nobody curbs their control of the financial system.
Yeah.
But by having an accountable, transparent economic system as a internalized system within the federation, people can say, okay, the federation is transparent, so the individual doesn't have to be.
Mm.
Because these institutions that want to hide things, they always put people forward as these great Kwisatz Haderach type people, where who are you to speak that your betters aren't doing everything they can for this nation? They are the heirs. I mean, it's practically the divine right of kings, but using modern terminology so it doesn't stick out as far.
Yeah.
And when you have that divine right of kings, we have to be accountable to society all the time.
Mm.
Whereas they clutch their pearls and say, look, if they can do this to me, they can do this to you. And the rest of us like, you do it to us all the time.
Mm.
We're
Yes, I
just
do.
saying it needs to be equally applied.
Mm.
So we're all accountable to each other. But apparently that's too far to ask.
Mm.
And what I'd like to show is that if you have a system that isn't corrupt, that is paired one to one with the corrupt system that all exists, people are start looking at their representative in the House or their senator saying, "Why are you such shit? And the people that I get to elect through the system that doesn't allow a two-party system, through ranked choice, why why is your quality so low, but this democracy's quality so high? And then that makes it 100% clear where the break is. It's not democracy, it's the corruption and the unaccountability of the corporate elite, of the financial elite within the credit markets, which have their ties to the fossil fuel industry because the financial markets are built on the back of the fossil fuel industry. They're one to one. Whatever they do, they're not going to make themselves accountable on their own.
Yeah.
So we want to be transparent, but we also want to be democratic, paired one to one. So we show all those areas. But then on top of that, for things that need to have privacy secured, but still have oversight, that's also where the auditors group comes in. So the auditors group can monitor the elections. They can monitor their respective district and various things along those lines. So everyone who's depending on this system knows that it's transparent and accountable. Two things that our political leaders are not. Because if they were transparent, there wouldn't be as many conspiracy theories. If they were accountable, they wouldn't need to use conspiracy theories to explain why everything is broken, to distract people with jazz hands from the corruption that is actually causing these problems. It's in their interest to say democracy doesn't work because they don't like democracy. It's their interest to say it's all your fault because they don't like you. It makes perfect sense. You just need to listen to them, not just what they say, but then compare it to what they do. I never understand some rich person who says, I love this country. I die for this country. And then they won't even pay taxes, while some working class kid is in the military, possibly getting killed. I'm far more likely to think that that kid who's dying to protect the beliefs of others has more invested in the Constitution and human rights than I could ever imagine someone who has this definition of America, which says the elite are at the top and the workers are just there to hold me up, to seize my potential. Because it's very easy for them to look like superhumans because everyone's had it. That boss who takes all the credit for the work of their underlings, the billionaires are the ones that do that. They're the ones that take the credit, literally the dollars, for the labor of others. I could sit here and say how smart I am and how brilliant and how infallible I am and so on and so forth. If you throw millions of dollars at a PR team and access to have my picture taken with all the right people and various things like that, and I have underlings to blame when things go wrong and underlings to take credit from when things go right. Of course, I look like a superhuman being. But the people that have this Ubermensch idea and want to posture like an Ubermensch because, gosh forbid, we see them as the human beings they are, because then we might realize they're not the best and brightest. They're not God's chosen. It's not the divine right of kings. They corrupt our democracies. They destroy the legacy of generations so they can build on top of it.
Yeah.
There's nothing you have ever built or your grandfather has ever built that they would not destroy in a heartbeat as long as it made green line go up on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And that's not democracy.
No, it's
So
not.
it's easy to see why people like that consider service members suckers and losers, because
Mm.
those suckers and losers are sacrificing and dying for something that may very well be against their interests.
Mm.
And only suckers and losers do that.
Mm. Very true. Very true. So, all things considered, what is your vision, for the future of ERCs and, their impact on global finance and, energy sustainability and, how do you plan to navigate challenges such as regulatory frameworks and, market acceptance?
Well, as I said, as long as ERCs stay up at the level of the accredited investor and they're not
Yeah.
like traded on public markets or anything like that, and you can't get much more accredited as an investor than a country.
Yeah.
And that's really more who our market is, or a banking system, which is really more who our market is. Because there is good reason why those regulations are in place and why I generally have disdain for a lot of cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, look, I get it. Crypto is just a technology, but the way that it's been used to date is more in Ponzi schemes with, you know, digital trappings to hide what's actually going on, where the productivity, the value that's actually being created is not just separating the working class from their money, but it's also money laundering for the various things that the working class is subject to
Mm.
under corrupt oligarchies, things like the drug trafficking and human trafficking and various things along those lines, the international slave trade.
Yeah.
The working class is not buying slaves, they can barely buy groceries. So, any conspiracy theory that you hear that blames a bunch of people that don't have money for really expensive practices like organized crime, it makes no sense. But
Mm.
once again, it really comes down to conspiracy theories exist to distract people from what is actually going on
Mm.
because our leaders don't want to explain it, either because their donors benefit from it or they themselves benefit, or some combination thereof.
Mm.
And because of that corrupt system, we have to be more transparent so they can keep us in line, and they get to be more opaque so
Mm.
they can take more of
Yeah.
society's benefits, sorry, words.
Mm.
So that, I see more the role of the ERC is up at that top level beyond where you and I might normally, well, most 99% might be involved,
Mm.
because you should not be responsible for your retirement investments
Yeah.
if that involves you're putting your retirement on public markets that can be manipulated by hedge funds to
Mm.
deprive you of your savings. And yet we have a tax code that was written to specifically encourage that.
Yeah.
Please, by all means, put your wealth on which you're depending for retirement onto our public markets that we have control of and we make the rules of,
Yeah.
so we can do 2008 to you, and then we get the benefit of the bailout. You lose all of your savings, and we'll
Yeah.
be back in 10 years to do it again. This is a really basic sleight of hand if we had leadership that was actually saying, right now, because of deregulation, the economy has been turned into a lot of levels. A This is my opinion, um, and I'm not CLU, CHFC, or anything like that. But I view a lot of those investments as a tax subsidized handout or redistribution to the rich. Because
Yeah.
as long as the deregulation allows them to abuse public markets and then benefit whether it wins or loses, if things go well, they make a lot of money. If things go poorly, they get to make an obscene amount of money.
Mm, mm, mm.
That's well income redistribution. People need to have a retirement that exists outside those kinds of manipulations.
Yeah.
So various projects like those programs may in time start making their own investments. So it's the Federation itself buying a whole bunch of green energy infrastructure to
Mm.
allow the boomer generation to retire, which could make the job market more competitive for the younger generations,
Mm.
and various other programs like the healthcare. And as I said, because our Costco meets social media system is designed to bring prices of necessities down versus use the scarcity for control, which drives prices up,
Mm.
people can lead better lives without having to learn the financial system, without learning economic policy, without having to hold down a management position that doesn't they don't enjoy it, they're not particularly good at it, but in order to move up the ladder, well, they've got to pretend, and that
Yeah.
involves taking credit for other people's work. That involves standing on other people and all these various things that get people into positions where they wouldn't even be happy.
Yeah.
And eventually they lose the job. And if they're lucky, they fail upward like many before them. And
Yeah.
that's how you get really bad middle management,
Mm.
because people who aren't well suited to the job have to go there out of advancement. One of the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, that the military rank structure ever did was eliminate the higher E level specialists,
Yeah.
because it used to be that there was specialists all the way up to I think even E8,
Mm.
where you could be a specialist but still advance. Today,
Mm.
a specialist is a single rank, it's E4.
Mm.
You can't spend your career in the military as degrees of specialists because, well, you've got to eventually put yourself in a leader leadership position. Because
Mm.
don't forget, we've all got to be Ubermensch, or at least be able to put ourselves forward as Ubermensch.
Yeah.
And that further leads to situations where neurodivergent people are overlooked for the more outgoing person who might have some charismatic qualities but might not necessarily know it have as deep of an understanding as someone who's more of a specialist in the field. They've got to take credit for that guy's work, because if they're not all that, they
Yeah.
have no hope of getting higher. Inspiring as heck, but you become less inspiring when you're not sharing the credit with the people who are helping you get there. Your team.
Very
Your
true.
team is your team, not your subjects. And the moment you forget that, you might as well be an officer.
Mm,
And the
very true.
worst officers are the ones that have have forgotten that the the NCOs are there to know those things.
Yeah.
But some officers, they've just got to be that guy who's good at everything, or that woman or other that's um, good at everything, because, well, that's just how you get that promotion. And eventually
Yeah.
you'll just get a bunch of unqualified people and unqualified teams at various levels, which creates widespread inefficiencies.
Mm,
So it's about making a system that can respond with hierarchy with when necessary, but encourages non-hierarchical thinking.
yeah.
And that involves having to recognize that this idea of the leader who knows absolutely everything and is excellent at everything is a myth. And if they tell you they are that guy, they're lying their ass off.
Mm,
I've
that's
encountered those guys, and they're usually the ones that think I'm incredibly arrogant. I'm like, okay, by what metric are you establishing this? And then I say, okay, now let's actually look at what the burden of that metric is to find out if you're meeting
mm,
it. And then I dismantle their entire, they say they're this thing, but they do none of what it takes to be that thing. They say they're a patriot, but they aren't willing to sacrifice for their country.
mm,
They say they'll die for their beliefs, but will they die for the beliefs of others and their
mm,
rights?
mm,
You
mm.
shouldn't lead someone in defense of the Constitution unless you hold that Constitution dear.
Yeah. Very true.
And that, to me at least, is the single greatest disqualification. I mean, Trump is disqualified on so many levels, in my view.
Mm,
But the fact that he calls service members suckers and losers, the fact that he thinks the working class needs saving,
mm,
they don't need to be saved. They need to be free
yeah.
and actually unleash their potential without having someone saying, I'm sorry, you can't work unless you have someone like me to
Mm,
facilitate it, because I have interest to the bank and
mm,
they'll give me as much money as I want to get the infrastructure which can facilitate your ability
mm.
to have access to the means of production. And that's
Yeah.
one of the many things that communism gets really wrong, is
Mm,
they're talking about often the factories and various things like that, where in reality that's a superficial means of production, in the sense that it's useless without the people.
yeah.
But the credit above that is the ability to get that. And if you can extend the credit to the people through a democratic system like the Federation, they can be unleashed themselves through democracy, through doing
Mm,
the things that the governments are corrupted not to.
mm,
They don't need the political science means of production. They need the actual system to allow them equal access so they can compete on those free markets to say, look, we know better, because
mm,
and we can do better. Because what
mm,
they have right now is a self-fulfilling prophecy of, you can't do it because you'll always struggle to raise money. And
mm,
by the way, the entire financial system of getting access to that credit and very working your way up in society is, in fact, a grooming process.
Yeah.
I believe that's one of the reasons why the right wing is so adamant about groomers and this and so on and so forth. Again, it's accuse the other guy of what you're actually doing. You have to be groomed against your self-interest. You have to
Yeah.
be groomed to compromise your integrity.
Mm.
Someone has to come up with a narrative that gives you permission to unleash your worst impulses on your neighbor
Yeah.
because you've got to, because otherwise your kids will starve. Well, maybe your kids won't starve, but who gets the real benefit, the 90% or 99% of that benefit? That benefit goes to someone who's not even part of that transaction.
Mm. So
But
unfortunate.
the unethical and amoral acts that you do, that's all on you, according to the guy who said, if you don't do it, your family will starve.
Mm.
There needs to be a free market opponent to that kind of system.
Mm.
That's why we're democratic. That's why we're tied into the financial system. But because our government is so corrupted right now through elements of the Supreme Court and the other branches, we do not have time to wait for them to call for their own accountability. It's been happening my entire life. It's not
Mm.
like the climate crisis is new. It used to just be called the climate change. Now it's a crisis and they're still clutching their pearls. So
Yeah.
thinking they're suddenly going to discover accountability and start addressing the climate crisis in the next 10 years while we're struggling to hold on to our very democracies, and the fossil fuel in global fossil fuel interests want to stir up a bunch of war because it's really good for fossil fuel prices.
Mm.
How are we supposed to both protect our democracies and invest in a better future and fix our respective societies if we're constantly being told, well, you better give up your rights, you
Mm.
better give up your freedoms because we've got to fight a war against those other people and they're
Mm.
communists?
Mm.
Well, what's the difference between a corporate oligarch and a party leader? Corporate oligarchs run the two-party system, so they're the party leaders.
Mm.
And in communism, party leaders are the party leaders.
Mm.
And if the party leaders of each side end up with all the money, you're not a different system, you're a different brand of the same system. Your
Mm.
terminology is different, but you're not investing in the future. You're not investing in the working class. You're not creating equitable exchange with the job market.
Mm.
You are using state violence and the threat of poverty and social separation
Mm.
to keep your workers in line. And if you have a problem with that feature in communism, I do not see how it is intellectually consistent to not have a problem with the exact same thing happening in the two-party system.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
we plan to not just try to make things more transparent within ourselves, but that'll ultimately, I think, make governments more transparent
Yeah.
because now people can choose not between the fossil fuel credit system of the oligarchy. They can now say, ah, yes, but we know how credit and finance works. We're going to do the same thing towards green energy infrastructure. And because we're actually workers versus oligarchs, we actually really do control the source of productivity, which is our labor.
Mm.
Let's see the oligarchs compete with that. Let's see fossil fuels compete with that. Oil's just oil.
Mm.
It's nothing without someone to take it out of the ground,
Yeah.
without someone to refine it.
Yeah.
They don't acknowledge that. The Federation acknowledges that first and foremost. That's why the UBI matters. That's why healthcare matters. That's why housing matters. And that's why all of that falls under the founder seat, which has its own allotment. And
Yeah.
their only job is to make good on all the promises of the Federation. Yeah, the founders committees and other groups have their own allotments,
Mm.
executive committee and whatnot. But the things that you see in these videos saying we want to have the healthcare, we want all of that stuff is being put under its own separate trust.
Mm.
And the sole purpose of that is to make sure all the promises are met, and that trust will ultimately oversee the other trust. And
Yeah.
both of these trusts will be democratically governed through their respective voting pools.
Mm.
And my family doesn't get to vote for a few generations.
Mm. Interesting. Interesting. So as we conclude, um, given the complexity and and innovation in the innovative nature of ERCs, what disclaimers or legal clarifications should individuals or institutions consider before engaging with ERCs?
Well, again, if a corporation or a country wants to invest in those things, we're built on transparency. So being able to say, okay, I want reports on this, so on and so forth, because those countries, if they're democratic, will be able to be the oversight on behalf of their people.
Mm.
You run into the question of, yeah, we can have you can have the um sorry, right.
No.
You can have the oversight of the auditors, you can have the oversight of the transparent system. You can have all sorts of oversight, but what happens if something is more urgent? Well, the founder's seat, which is a democratically elected seat, can also summarily fire people in positions where they show they have a conflict of interest.
Mm.
Even the appearance of it, looking at you, United States Supreme Court. Now, the other thing that can happen in extreme situations is that the one role our family does play is there can be petitions to fire the founder seat because they are not following through on the promises of the federation, as well as they are not firing certain people that are clearly in conflict of interest. People are screaming left and right, look how bad this is. You need to fire them now. It will no longer be a situation of, well, there's just another election in 5 more years, 6 more years, or whatever. You better just let them do all that damage. No. If the auditors find something having audited that person, or it's the appearance that founder seat can just fire that person, and if they don't, they can fire the founder seat. But
Yeah.
our family does not replace the founder seat. Then it goes to back to the election.
Mm.
So you often run into who watches the watchers. Well, within the Federation, you have the auditors, and externalized to the auditors and the founders seat. External to the Federation, you have the family representative, but more importantly, you have the other participating governments who have oversight of the accounting without necessarily transparency, absent subpoena, and so on and so forth, into the accounts themselves. Because we are transparent, so the people don't have to be.
Mm.
So they want to see how much money was generated through green energy sales so they can audit to make sure that they're making their investment back under the terms and conditions.
Mm.
That they have that access as long as it doesn't go into people's accounts. That's just good auditing.
Mm.
And how are people going to necessarily know that we're being accountable ourselves? One of the problems with government right now is that there is not a separation of power, it's all under corporate control.
Mm.
So if we put this under this democratic control, and 200, 300 years from now, someone figures out how to game that system, I see the governments as a check and balance against a international corporation, which I hope this LLC trust eventually becomes.
Mm.
So they don't need to trust the ERC. They get to verify the ERC.
Yeah. Mm.
Trust, when it comes to your economic system itself,
Mm.
should not weigh into it. If there is reason to not trust your economic system, you get what we have today. And I'd like to break this cycle,
Mm.
because what constantly happens is someone gets control of that economic system, and they skim a little bit for themselves. And hey, it doesn't break the system. It's just benefits to God's chosen after all. And the people that choose God's chosen, the divine right and all. But then another generation happens, and eventually they boil that frog over so many generations. There's a reason why the right wing is so consistently against the teaching of history, because they always want to tell people it's always been this way, when in fact they're not being conservative. They're destroying the system which created the country that the boomers grew up in. It's
Yeah.
them moving to an earlier economic system, which led to a very unstable and dangerous time for the working class, where slavery was weaponized against the working class to make sure that the oligarchs stayed in charge. Just like you're going to, I suspect, with the recent conservative Supreme Court ruling that you can imprison people for being homeless.
Mm.
And if you can imprison people for being homeless, that makes them exempt from the protections against slavery. So becoming homeless and losing your job is signing you up for slavery. So then the state and the for profit prison system can now sell your labor extra cheap to the local corporations.
Mm.
That further undermines the working class, that puts more people on the streets
Mm.
and puts more people in the prisons without civil or human rights.
Yeah.
So I would like to break that cycle first and foremost, especially when you take into account the percentage of the homeless community that is veterans.
Yeah.
They are in a bad state because, in part, because of this service to their country, and in other part, because of the whole labor system being broken. And they
Yeah.
deserve better. And I would be willing to stand on a podium and debate anyone who would like to say that veterans don't deserve better.
They do.
And they certainly should not be weaponized through forced labor against the working class in the Constitution that they swore to uphold and defend. And that's the Supreme Court that created that mechanic that is going through its own corruption scandals because they're being sponsored by billionaires through the Heritage Foundation. So, do you think they could get away with it if there was someone who could summarily fire them for the appearance of a conflict of interest? Do you think billionaires could buy them off so handily if it was without lifetime appointments? We don't have a capitalist society. We have a rigged economy under the Supreme Court who's working for billionaires that wants to weaponize the homeless against the living wage and the working class. There, as far as I can tell, there's no other way to see it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's a billionaire class that's bankrolling this corruption.
Yeah. It's definitely not a coincidence. But this is very insightful, and it's always incredible talking to you about these things. And we know that a lot of people have been enjoying, these episodes, and we hope that we can have you on for more, because we always have so many topics that we would like to talk, socioeconomic issues, and there's so much that the Federation addresses, and we hope that future episodes will help us explore more of these. But for today, we'd like to really thank you for all your insights, and this has been incredible. And thank you once again for always being there to guide us the step forward, and to show us all these evil things, for lack of a better word, all the socioeconomic issues that happen in the world that most people might not even realize that are happening.
One more thing, I would like to say that for people who would like to participate in this conversation, by all means, put in the comment section questions you would not like to ask me, but may like to ask our systems administrator for the social media site, or questions you would like of the founder seat. We are currently in the process of creating these trusts. We have someone who has agreed in principle to become the founder seat, who I think is perfectly suited for it. And I hope you all who happen to see this are able to provide questions for them as well. So looking forward to watching those myself, especially because I won't be in them.
It's always a hoot. Definitely, we're definitely going to do that. So as you've heard, we invite your questions, feedback on YouTube and on Spotify and Anchor. There's always a Q&A tab at the bottom, so feel free to ask questions and engage with us. So thank you so much, John, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.